last night, I had a chance to talk to Adrianna for a bit, and it was pretty interesting because we were talking about interview process, and she very quickly asserted that everything I'm doing is completely wrong.
How's everybody doing tonight? I mean, this morning. Sorry. No. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself. Like Mike said, I am a mother. I'm a single mother of a 5-year-old boy, very beautiful. I just recently started working at Sales Loft. It is the #1 place to work in Atlanta, and we are hiring if you're looking for a move. I am also part of the Women Who Code Atlanta leadership team. If there are any Women Who Code or any chapters from Chicago, I would love to talk to you. So a little bit about this topic. Before I started working at Sales Loft, I worked at an agency, and before that I worked at MailChimp. I interned there. At the agency, I was hired as a React Native apprentice, and I built some React Native apps, Rails web apps, and then I got to lead my first React project without any experience. That's when I realized I want to be a full-time React developer. I worked at the agency for a few more months until I realized, okay, I need a new job, and I want to work in React only, and any of React tools that are available out there now. And so I went through like a little bit of a struggle. I interviewed with so many companies for a year, but with every company I learned something new, but there were very common patterns between all the interviews I had. So I'm gonna talk a lot about that. I'm gonna talk about some interviews that I failed and a lot of interviews that went really well that I got offers from as well, especially if I'm working at a new job at SalesLoft. So these are the things we'll go over. It's a lot of stuff. I don't want you to think that it's like an intro to React thing, but so I'm gonna be vulnerable with you guys through every slide. I'm gonna talk about every experience that I had. I'm gonna try to go through it as much as I can in 25 minutes that we have. If not, we'll go a little bit over if you guys don't mind. So yeah. All right, so there's definitely a lot of opinions about whiteboarding. Some people can do it, some people can't. I'm one of those who have a really hard time, and maybe because it was my first role in going into React, but I was so lucky that I didn't have to whiteboard at all. So I mostly had to do repos, assessments, pair programming. I had so many conceptual questions, and some of them I got wrong, some of them I got right. I remember doing a phone interview for a startup in Atlanta, and he hammered me with so many conceptual questions that he didn't even leave enough time for me to ask questions. That's a red flag, by the way. So yeah, we'll talk about those different things. So one of the biggest questions I always get with the same interview, they want to know what's your interpretation of React. You don't want to do the textbook version. You don't want to say, oh, it's a it's a JavaScript UI library. Duh, we knew that. So you kind of want to have your own interpretation of what React is. I kind of like to say it's the V in the MVC framework. It's where we write in JSX where it gets transpiled into HTML for the DOM and stuff. So those are different things that you can say, but always have a representation of what you want to your interpretation of what React should be. Biggest questions that always get talked about is learning about what state and props are. They are centered around React, so it's very important to know what each is. I got asked which is state or props changeable or immutable or anything like that, and at that point I knew what state and props were, but I didn't know that you couldn't like actually change props if you're actually passing them down. So they always have to be existing where they're at. It's state that you can change, right? State is what you want to go ahead and pass down data, and props is your component's properties. So prop drilling, I had to do a GitHub assessment, not an assessment, a repo. And the project was already set for me, files, names, everything, the whole file structure was set, and they had different components where I had to pass in data eventually by making an API call. And so I think prop drilling is very important to know about if you're given a project, or if you just want to talk about conceptually how you're going to build out your project, break down your components. Kent C. Dodds has a very great article about prop drilling. And at the end of this slides, there's actually going to be a whole bunch of resources that I put together that'll be very helpful. So yeah, it's very important. As you can see, with these very simple components, there's the switch button, switch mesh, and switch, and toggle. And so the toggle has the information that we want to pass down all into our components. And this is going to be very helpful to think about, especially when you start to realize there's too many props getting passed down everywhere. That's where React context is going to be very helpful to know about. So the React hooks has been very life-changing, if you guys haven't seen before, but I don't know how most companies work. My company, we update once it's been released in the full version, not in a beta or alpha or anything like that. So we like to stay updated. And so React hooks and Lifecycle hooks and where they are right now, it can be very confusing, especially going into interviews and they want you to figure out how to make an API call. When I was interviewing, React hooks had not been released officially in the final version. So what I knew was the Lifecycle hooks, but I do know the React hooks now. And so it's very important when you're going to an interview, always asking like, what React version are you guys on? Are you guys using hooks or something? A lot of people, I had the misconception that, even if React hooks are out, you should know your Lifecycle hooks because it's very good to know what's under the hood. That's a misconception. I talked to my colleague, Ray, my coworker, he's really awesome, and he told me, no, you shouldn't know anything about Lifecycle hooks anymore because Lifecycle hooks goes against React's declarative form of their library. And so you want to just learn how to use hooks versus going back to Lifecycle hooks. You don't need to know any of that anymore because you don't want to write. The point is classes in React. The reason you would need Lifecycle hooks, you need a class in a React. But now we're going against that. We're trying to go against using classes in React. To do more of a declarative instead of an imperative way. Oh, just another thing is if you always encounter a company who hasn't increased their version of their React, I think it's always a good way to say, oh, well, if you know a little bit more about hooks, I can talk about hooks and we can see about how we can change or increase the React's version at your company. It's always a good way to impress your hiring manager. So making API hooks, I'm not going to talk about it in Lifecycle hooks, but with React hooks, you want to use the use effect in order to get the API call. In use state, so use state is the equivalence of the constructor and takes maybe 5 lines of code and turns it into 1. It's very useful, and then the use effect is where you want to go ahead and get the API call to get that response and then pass it down into your component, to the JSX. I think this is going to be really important because once I was in an interview, they asked me, how would you make an API call? And this was the example we used with Lifecycle hooks. I told them I would do a custom function up in the component did mount and to reflect back on that. And of course, the React component would be a class rather than a stateless class. All right, so we're going to go over some JS built-in functions. As you can see, there's only some starred ones we're going to talk about, but we're going to talk about a few increased ES6. I think now we're like on ES8, ES10, but there's so many. It's so hard to keep up now. But these are some of the basic stuff I think that is very important to know. You're not going to get asked all the time about it, but I think it gives you a good level of where you're like. Code can be very time consuming. The more lines you write, it can be too much. And so you want to write less lines as much as possible. And so a lot of these things are helpful with that stuff. So when I was first starting out, I had a problem always figuring out what should I use, map or for each, map or for each. It took a while for me to understand, but I finally got the gist of it. And map is definitely one that you want to use if you're trying to create a new array and display it and get a new array returned back. And it is the runtime on it is a lot better than for each. And so the for each is if you want to do something with the array but not exactly change it. And you can also pass in a function. These are, I think, very important questions, especially when it comes about to displaying your data that you get from whatever API you're calling from or whatever data that you're being passed in. And so map is really important, and for each, just know which one to use on that part. And so I have those two examples right here, the for each. This necessarily doesn't return anything back, but this is what it looked like versus using .map. You should get the new array returned back from doubled. This is a pretty simple concept for the arrow functions. It's just a lot better way to write your functions rather than writing out the keyword function and doing the whole thing. And the arrow functions allows you to do it from one line or even skipping the return if you do it on one line as well. So this will be a lot helpful when writing out your code. Especially if you're gonna have to code in front of somebody or something like that, lets them know you're knowledgeable of the latest stuff to write in. So var, let, and const. This concept has been very confusing to me over the years, but once you get the gist of it and learn once you're coding, I was asked once, what's your preference? And it's not really about your preference, but it's about what you need in your code. I'm an avid user of constant. I always use it, but if it comes to the point where I need to change my variable, then you're gonna need to use something else. And so with var, you're function scoped, and so you can go ahead and use var. Most of the time people use var on that port. When you use let, you're at block scoped. These things are very important. You can use it in curly braces, the for loop, or an if statement. But after that, you are on your own and you've got to use something else. And const is the same thing as let, except for that you can't change the constant itself. Can't change it into a new value. So destructuring, this is a time saver, especially if you're trying to bring in a lot of props from somewhere or something like that. This is gonna be something that's gonna be very helpful for you to do that instead of equaling to every single up to 3 lines or even more if you're doing more variables. Destructuring can be very helpful, when you're passing in state and stuff. So the spread operator. I used to avoid the spread operator when I was going into React, just overall because I renamed props over and over again. I passed down, I wanted to see what was happening to my data. I didn't understand it, and I got asked, oh, do you use the spread operator? I was like, no, I don't use it because I'm just still trying to understand the code, but I know what it does. And so this is helpful in regards to, like I said, time consuming. When you have so many things, you can just pass in the things. You just have to be careful with what you're naming things and making sure things are consistent. All right, this is my favorite thing. Has anybody worked with sets? Can I get a raise of hands? Sets? Okay, so if you don't know what sets are, they're really awesome, especially if you're trying to create an array or an array of objects and you need them all to be unique. You don't need to do the filter. You don't need to use the filter or anything like that. Sets allows you to have this whole list and makes sure that it's all the values are unique. Even if you're writing a function and you have to add things over and over, it won't add it for you because it needs to stay unique and has all these built-in functions: add, has, size, delete, that allows you to use this. This is very important, especially if you have a table and you need to do bulk edit actions or anything like that, delete stuff. And so it's very important to know about this certain feature. I think it's very, how do you say, the runtime is a lot better than having to use a filter or find an different things like that. It's very useful, and so I hope when you guys get the chance, if you haven't used it, please use it. And so this is the last slide, and these are just a bunch of resources that I put together that helped me over the years getting together. And so I hope this guide can help anybody who is looking for their first React role, or if you are also looking to figure out what about your technical interviews, if you're a hiring manager and you're trying to figure out about your technical interviews, how you can structure them or how they're going to be helpful about the different knowledge that you're looking for. All right, thank you guys.